It's become a bit of a tradition for our symposiums to host a panel discussion with our guest speakers and wherever possible to have somebody living with dementia join us as well to give their expertise and insights. And we thought this year would be no different. And when we're thinking about the topic and we're thinking about autonomy, we're thinking about the domains of well-being, we thought it'd be really interesting to have a bit of a panel discussion around human rights and how human rights are often eroded for people with dementia. And a particular interest about the conflict sometimes that arises for us as professionals, as practitioners, as service providers, as managers, about how we get that balance right. So we're going to throw those difficult questions over to you, really, to come up with and find. And really, I guess we're hoping that you've got some things that have always niggled away at you that you'd really like to ask the panel their opinions on in regards to human rights and people with dementia. Now, if you haven't really thought too much about the issue, I'll just give you a couple of examples that niggle at me that I think are really good examples of what's going on out there that society seems to think's okay, or at least society doesn't seem to want to address, or society just hasn't thought about. And so I'm using the big S for society, government, community, service providers, and people living with dementia as well, and families. So I was over in Sydney last week and was talking to a research group over there, and they've been doing a really interesting research study on the use of psychotropic medication in residential care and how do we actually go about reducing it. And in this study, what they found in New South Wales, they have some legislation that in order for somebody with dementia to be put on psychotropic medication, they have to either give consent themselves or there has to be proxy consent, signed proxy consent by the family carer. And of the 143 participants in this study who agreed to be part of the study, only one had the correct legal documentation in place. 1 out of 143. So 142 of the people have been put on this psychotropic medication pretty much against the law. How's that happen? How's that happen? The other thing that I guess for me is the niggle, and I'm going to take the privilege of having the first question on this because I read with great interest Al's blog on the locked door issue, is when you think about our society and you think about incarcerating somebody out of our society, locking them away against their will, how many groups of people can you think that happens to without any legal system in place to protect them? Murderers, they go through a legal process. Refugees, poor refugees have some sort of process. And yeah, it takes a while and ends up on another island somewhere. People with a mental health condition who need a secure environment at that point in their mental health condition, have a mental health act. So we have all of these systems in place, and yet people with dementia every day come into environments where we lock the door and expect them to stay regardless of if they want to stay or not. And we have no legal system that actually supports or challenges that. So that's a really interesting thought about why does society think that that's okay. And so I'm going to pose my first question around that, really. And that is, I'd like to ask the panel their views, because this is a really complicated question, I guess. It's not simple. So how do we get the balance right between a person's human rights, a family carer's expectations of services, and really operational risk for organisations and their concern of duty of care? So across those three areas, there's obviously some competition often happens between what the human rights of a person is, and everyone in this room has those same rights, and what families sometimes expect and want from the service, and also the duty of care and concern issues around staff around that as well. And in particular reference to, I guess, the locked environment and the secure environment, which many of us here, including Alzheimer's WA, still have in some of our care environments. So, any of the panel like to start?
I think we've got to start off with the before the journey begins. So obviously things like this around getting people's interest. But when people come to us at Bethany, they're usually in crisis. There's an elderly relative of 90 years who's been looking after their loved one for 10 years and they've had a heart attack, and so the family are in Sydney, there's nobody else in WA. What can you do? And then when the family are given choices, there's not very many choices because of the bed situation. We're all struggling to find respite. or the respite that we provide is not really the respite that we should be providing, where people are coming into care with people much more at a terminal end of life, so people that are not at that stage get really frightened. We've got cultural issues within staff that's endemic, and I heard before someone saying, well, this staff changes, cutbacks, etc. But if we look at the UK and the fact that they've reduced psychotropic medication in men and reduced the incidence of dementia in men, and they've actually increased the Dementia Friends programme, where they've increased communities from all different avenues of business streams to get more involved to be a dementia friend. We've got a lot of work to do without just saying take the locks off the doors, because I don't think Perth is actually ready for that. I'm ready for it. Pele's ready for it. But our board and our community and our staff and our families are not ready for it. And also, often I get asked to come and speak to residents who are bullying other residents to say he or she shouldn't live in this facility anymore. They need to go to that lot place up in Yanchep because they can't stay at this place anymore. So we've got we as an industry, we've got a lot to do still before people actually come to need in that advanced care planning phase.
I suppose I was thinking of coming at it from the angle of maybe the metro, or learning a little bit from communities, because on communities, and Faye and I discussed this a fair bit before I felt I could sit here and make any comment anyway, the lengths to which people go to avoid putting their loved ones into situations where there's a locked door situation is great. And I'm thinking of a community member on a community up the peninsula who has quite serious dementia, and her carer and her immediate family don't live on that community, but the community as a whole more or less take care of her in terms of when she wanders from her house, she'll have a sort of a set pattern, and she'd go from place to place, and people marshal her around the place, and she's safe. We've all sat down and sat with the clinic and sat with the administration, sat with the store, sat with everyone, and that community sort of bands together to ensure that she can just wander around, and she's a traditional owner of the area, and nothing would be worse for her than for her to go to a residential facility. And similarly, there's another fellow I can think of who has gone to a residential facility, but it's in a town where he's known, and they've done a risk assessment plan, and he's allowed, like the example of, I think, Fred, he's allowed to, they've negotiated that he can leave when he wants, and if he's not back within a certain, there are protocols in place. And so he is well known in the community, and again, community members would just, take care of him and bring him back. And so I think it's from the other side of people are willing to go to great lengths not to even put their loved ones in those sort of situations.
I guess I was thinking of a number of things while you were speaking, and certainly a lot while Al was, about what makes the person want to get out anyway. And they talk about behavior problems. This person, you touch them and they want to fight or whatever. And it's not been uncommon for people to be found to have, they've had an undiagnosed fracture or something. They had a fall, and when they're being touched, they're being hurt. And that's why they're arcing up and so forth. With the psychotropic drugs, there's a lot of resistance. I know that they're allowed here when they're not in other places, but they're just often used because physical restraints are more obvious and frowned on strongly, and it's just seen as an easy way. But, there is such a thing as the dignity of risk, but the dignity of risk, applying that to the person themselves as an ethical principle, it doesn't take away the fear of the organisation, because if anything goes wrong, the media will be on it in 2 seconds flat, and there'll be court cases and all sorts of other things. So trying to look at everyone's rights and balance all of that is really, really important. But I like this idea that JJ was just talking about with the communities, because I'm currently working on a project for Department of Health in Tasmania, developing a Tasmanian palliative care community charter. And the underpinning principle is compassionate communities. And how and they're looking at if a person is diagnosed with that they are requiring palliative care, if they start their palliative care journey, mobilising the whole community, even people who don't know them, to be able to set up support systems. And I'm just thinking while you were speaking, JJ, that we should be looking at the same compassionate communities approach, perhaps when someone has been diagnosed with dementia. There's one difficulty there, though, and that is that some people are so proud and so independent that they don't want people coming into their home. And it's, for me, it's kind of like having all the balls in the air all at the same time. So all I've done is given you some ideas and thoughts without a solution yet. So I'm thinking perhaps when Al starts talking, or perhaps when Barry starts talking, is it Barry? Yeah. Yes, Barry, sorry, Barry. We might get a few more thoughts, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Colleen. Barry, I'll come to you next.
Yeah.
Can you, I guess, give us some insight of how you see the balance between your right to choose and the support that you might need in the future?
In the future or now?
Oh, whichever you prefer.
Okay. I mean, look, I'm getting exceptional support at the moment, and I'm enjoying every minute of it. Yeah. And without that support, I wouldn't be where I am today and what I am doing today. And I thank the Alzheimer's Association for that. Yeah. As far as in the future, I'm always positive, and I know that it's going to be something positive. Something like the previous question about locking up and all that, I don't want to know about all that, because I would never ever put myself in a position where I would be under locked doors. You know what I mean? I don't want to even think about that. You know what I mean?
So that for you is not an option?
It's not an option.
Right. And I know in a study that we did using GPS technology to support people to continue to walk, there was a lot of ethical debate at the time. This was a few years ago, before it became more mainstream, and the civil rights people were saying, this is outrageous, it's like tagging animals. And our take was quite the reverse, because people with dementia were telling us, if this allows me to continue to lead the lifestyle that I choose to lead, then bring it on. And I think, Barry, that's a really strong sentiment about, no, this isn't right for me, and it will never be right for me. And I think our challenge is then, what do we do with that into the future? Instead of just accepting that people with dementia will need to be locked up, when people like Barry say, this will never be right for me, our challenge as a society becomes, what do we do with that? Al, any final thoughts?
I'll just reflect on some of the other comments. I think that, first of all, listening to what Colleen said about communities where people just sort of naturally help each other, and Angeline talked about that as well. It makes you think that maybe residential care needs to be more dementia-friendly too, so that we have more of a all-hands-on-deck approach. If neighbors can do it, why can't professional staff find ways to collaborate and keep people safe? I agree with Michelle that this is not something that can be done quickly. We learned this with physical restraints when I started in long-term care, that you don't just untie everybody and do nothing else and expect them to be safe and never fall. And so it is a process, and this is where the transformation really comes in. And to talk about, and Colleen mentioned, why is the person leaving? I talk about this in that blog post. I have a very simplistic way of looking at why people are trying to repeatedly exit. It's very simplistic. They're either trying to find something that's not there, or they're trying to get away from something that is there.
Absolutely.
And it could be finding something just as simple as fresh air and a little variety. It could be finding meaning if you're bored, or finding relationships if none are provided for you. And there could be environmental stressors, relational stressors, other things in the environment. So in the second part of my blog, I go through a whole list of things that you have got to look at in the physical, relational, and operational environment before you can say it's the person's brain disease making them want to leave. And then there's dozens of things. So it is a process, and you do need that transformation so that you can find ways to accommodate individuals safely without an absolute restriction, like a locked door, that type of thing. And I will say, as far as the legal concerns and the risk concerns, it's great. It's great, balancing what Barry just said and what Colleen talked about this morning. Maybe when people have dementia, part of their early discussions should include advanced directives about what are situations that I would not find tolerable with risk versus safety. So we have some guidance about those values if they can't tell us later. But I was going to make one more comment about that. Oh yeah, the legal thing. When I started in long-term care, there were occasional family members who would say to us, "We will sue you if you untie my mom and she gets hurt." Then after several years, people said, "We will sue you if you tie my mom." And the same things happened with antipsychotics. Back when I had a public phone number, when I worked at St. John's, I got cold called several times a year by lawyers or families who wanted me to fly around the country and testify at trials where people were suing providers for giving antipsychotics to the relatives. So the pendulum shifts back and forth. So when the consumers decide, as Barry does, that I'm not going to tolerate the situation, if we're really moving toward more of a consumer-directed care culture, then the pendulum may swing and help us to really say, okay, yeah, we're not ready for that yet in WA, but we've got to be, because this is what our consumers demand. We've got to put our brains together and figure it out.
A village within a facility where the people with dementia are, where they can go outside and to the shop and to the bus stop or to whatever, but it's actually all within an enclosed area. So they do feel that they can go and buy a few groceries, they can have a cup of coffee, they can wander outside.
Yeah, there are lots of intermediate steps. You can start by opening the door of that living area and alarming the outer doors. You can have an outdoor courtyard that people can go to. So there's many intermediate steps between just letting everybody go all over the community. I just have to share, if I can, a really funny story I was sharing at the break, because this shows how our concerns about safety get a little ridiculous sometimes. My friend Karen Stobie was looking for a place for her mother, who lives with Alzheimer's, who she cared for 10 years. She was touring a place, and she saw a beautiful courtyard with a garden, and it had a fence around it, or a hedge or something. And she went out. It was a beautiful day, so she pushed on the door instinctively, and it was locked. And she said to the woman giving the tour, "Is this door always locked?" And the woman said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, it's beautiful. Why can't people go outside?" And she said, "Well, someone fell out there and got hurt." And Karen's response was, "Has anyone ever fallen indoors and gotten hurt?" So once again, sometimes it makes no sense, the rules that we come up with.
With regards to advanced care directives,
yes.
And I'm a widow. Right. I had a husband who did an advanced care directive. I'm going back a few years now, but he was in RPH, and the only forms that were available were from Fremantle Hospital at the time. To my knowledge, there are still no easily available, advanced care forms. Now, if you go to the post office, you can see make your own will. You can see, power of attorney. But I've never seen a form that is an advanced care directive that is easily available for people to use. I haven't got one, and that's because I've got a will. But when I went to make a will, they didn't say, "Would you like to do an advanced care directive as well?"
Okay.
So I don't think that people are aware of them.
Sure.
I don't think they're easily available.
Yes, they
and
are.
I don't know that people know what to put on them if they're going to make one up themselves.
Sure. Now, your third point is a very, very, very important one. Preparing for today, I just went quickly online and typed in Advanced Directives WA and downloaded one off one of the websites, and the Enduring Guardian form as well, with some instructions about it. It's pretty simplistic, but it's in a very brief one. And this is something also that people often ask, is they want a really short advanced directive. Now, the ones that I designed for, which are part of the Queensland legislation, and the ones that I for use in New South Wales, and I've done one in New South Wales for use in res care and one for LGBTI people, etc., etc. They're not very short because they're written at a grade 9 language level, so that people can understand what is an advanced directive, can anyone make one, what should I think about. So they have those things in them. But to make them useful for use in a clinical situation, there has to be enough information in them. I mean, you sometimes see people write something that says, "Don't use extraordinary means." Okay, what's extraordinary to me might be quite commonplace to my doctor. Useless in a clinical situation. Don't use heroic efforts, same problem. On the other hand, I do understand that people don't want to be filling out copious pages.
It was just a very short addendum to the Advanced Health Directive, which was, I mean, we've got DNR. You can put DNR above your bed. So rather than go through all of that, isn't that going to be enough?
No. DNR, do not resuscitate. That's one little tiny bit of the things you can accept or reject. Do you want, artificial ventilation, nutrition, hydration, whatever? One of my colleagues had DNR above the bed of one of her patients, and a nurse came around the corner and saw the man choking on a piece of food and stood there because she didn't think she was supposed to do anything. So my colleague changed it to say, this patient would not benefit from cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The Advanced Directive also allows a person to say under what conditions they want these things to happen. If, in the opinion of my treating medical practitioner, I'm in the terminal phase of a terminal illness, or whatever. So giving much more specific information.
Okay.
What rights does a person living with dementia have with regards to choosing to return to live independently at home with support post-hospital admission?
I can answer that.
Okay, really interesting question. Thank you, Nikki. Michelle, did you want to go first?
Contact an occupational therapist to do a hierarchy of dementia scale strengths-based assessment. Work out what the person can still do and book a care plan. Implement interventions that support that person to live well. And find a community provider. And I can recommend my friends in Bunbury. They're in this room that will go along with a case manager and help you and your family plan person-centred care. We need to start thinking about, I know that the standards, the paper that came out last year saying that we needed more standards for Australia in terms of management of dementia. If every single one of us in this room went back to our provider tomorrow and said, right, we are not going to have restraints in our facilities anymore. I'm talking about lap belts, I'm talking about physical restraint, that we are going to not do that. That between the hours of 7:30 in the morning and 6:30 at night, just as a trial, we're going to unlock all the doors, get more volunteers in for a few days, and just see what happens. If we did that, I think we could change a lot of things.
Good. JJ, can I ask the communities, here in the Metro, it's a massive issue. If you're basically admitted to hospital with dementia, the chances of you going home are very, very slim. In the community, in the sort of more remote and regional communities with regional hospitals, is that the same experience, or do you find there's a better connection back to community?
No, it isn't. But that's because it's a small, I'm thinking just of Broome Hospital, and you'll be seen by the same team of OTs and physios that go out to work with our clients in Bijadanga, so they know who those clients are, they know who their carers are. We liaise quite closely with them, so there's someone in the hospital, it's called the OPI position, Older People's Initiative. They make sure that there's a transition from hospital to community, and obviously my role and my colleagues who do the same role in different parts of the Kimberley are involved. So we're at a bit of an advantage, I think, in some of these discussions, because we're quite I would say everyone knows everyone, and everyone seems to be a whole bunch of good people with the interests of the clients at heart. And just a quick one about advanced care planning. I haven't, in my experience, 5 or 6 years doing remote care coordination, ever managed to get a client across the line, because it's just anathema to it relies on those same relationships between all the other care staff working on that client to progress note those clients' wishes as they talk, because people won't, because of third language problems,
and distrust
sign
of
something
government
and
forms.
distrust the forms, and no, they won't say, and no one's going to say about their loved one, don't do this, because then it falls upon that person that has said that. So it often falls on, like that, your question. Now it often falls on the healthcare professionals, the likes of Faye, to collectively have a pool of knowledge on which to draw about the care of that person.
Thanks, JJ. Al, the American experience of hospital admission for people with dementia, is it any better than ours?
It's horrible.
Okay.
This is actually a problem I don't think anyone's solved. I've worked with some people at NHS Highlands up in Scotland who have maybe come up with some of the best hospitalization experience I've seen yet. Really coming up with documents, particularly people that transfer from residential care to the hospital, documents telling you all about the person, explaining the person, so the staff have knowledge, more efficient transfer of information. Volunteers who actually come and spend time with the person to help allay anxiety, explain what's going on, and take over some of the non-skilled work that the staff doesn't have time to do, but is so important to the person. So they have a lot of things going on. I actually put in a proposal with a local hospital to try and help solve their hospitalization experience for people with dementia by using deeper culture change processes. Because once again, I think it's not so much lack of education. We've all had, the help program of Sharon Inouye and all these things, but it's systems. Systems get in the way. Systems say, oh, that person over there with dementia, we need that bed. Let's move them over here. And of course, the person's half delirious, and now they're really confused. Or rotate staff, or keeps people, boarded in the emergency room for hours and hours. So it really requires that culture change, and hospitals haven't done that, where you really go in and challenge systems. And I think the best way to do is to find a hospital that doesn't make tons of money from organ transplants, where people with dementia are low on their priority list, a community hospital that really can change systems more adroitly than a large university or tertiary hospital is a place to do it. They felt that they didn't have enough of a problem for me to come in and do it. So I'm still looking for the place to do that, but I think that's important. The other thing I just mentioned as far as advanced directives, and I don't think anyone explicitly said this, but it has become pretty much standard practice in the U.S. that the GP talks to people at routine physicals and says, do you have one? Do you have any questions? And if you have a trusting relationship with a doctor, it's a great place to start that discussion. When you're healthy, when there's no crisis, get that paper on file with the person who provides medical care, and a copy with a lawyer, family members, whatever. So that's another avenue for people that feel like I have no information.
And a copy uploaded onto your My Health record, which the funding has now been provided for that to happen, so that they can travel with the person around. But just one quick thing in terms of human rights, I just want to add here, and about people going home from hospital or not. We've got to take two people into account here, particularly if there are only two people in the relationship, and that's the carer. Carers sometimes go first because the burden is so heavy. And yes, if we can mobilise the community, we can take some of the burden off the carer. But if someone does have a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties, then their rights as well have to be considered. There's one of the organisations I've been on their board, Feros Care. They've come up with some wonderful electronic equipment in that if someone has a person with dementia who gets up in the middle of the night and wanders, then the carer often doesn't get any sleep because they're alert all night, waiting for the person to get up. They have a mat that goes beside the bed of the person with dementia. When the person steps out of bed, the carer, it's not an alarm, it shakes their pillow until they wake up. And so they can go to sleep, go soundly asleep, get some decent rest, because they will wake up when the person gets out of bed. So we also can start to be a little bit creative in terms of what technology's around.